It's a great pleasure to be here today. Many friends, family, colleagues, thanks for making time to come and listen. The first thing that I need to say before I go further is that all of the work that I'm going to show you today is not mine alone. It's the work of a collective and quite a large group of people, some of whom are in these pictures, some of whom are in the audience today and maybe recognize themselves. My professional journey, as Christo mentioned, started in the United Kingdom, where I was born. I was born into an exile family. My dad was a South African exile. My mother is British. So I spent the first 26 years of my life in the United Kingdom. And my first experience of South Africa was around about the mid-1990s, when my dad was able to come back into the country and we could come and visit family and get a feel for the place. This rather slightly narcissistic diagram that I've got on the wall right here charts the kind of professional journey that I've had in South Africa since 2004. That began with a very small company called Ikemeleng Architects back in 2004, and has ended up today with a group of 5 entities that employ 96 people across 5 offices, working across multiple sectors in multiple countries. So I've been very fortunate to have seen an interesting professional path during my time in South Africa. But like many of us, I think, having now been here almost 20 years, we're beginning to reflect on where I come from, my professional journey, but also where we've come from as a society. I'm sure many of you will recognize this image as a picture of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission back in the late 90s. It was set up as a kind of meeting of the souls to heal our apartheid, the wounds of the apartheid era. But many people are disappointed with the outcomes of that process and that it wasn't ever followed through, particularly in the spheres of economic inequality and land ownership. This is a very topical debate at the moment. What I want to suggest is that there's been no spatial meeting of the souls to follow on from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that's a kind of theme of the projects that I want to show today. I've always been interested as much in the spaces between buildings as I've been in the buildings themselves. This is a drawing that I did in my final year at the Bartlett almost 20 years ago that talks about or attempts to capture territorial patterns that admit or exclude, that encourage certain behaviors and discourage others, adopting a graphic language and borrowing a graphic language from that of military maps, and beginning to map these spatial territories and speculate on interventions to break these down, to break them into smaller pockets, to granulate them, and to admit and include a greater number of people. So I looked at the idea of an exclusionary armory of sometimes quite subtle interventions and mechanisms, changes of level, changes of surface, roof cover, defensible spaces, social codes linked to consumption. So very subtle kind of changes around that accept certain behaviors, accept certain people, and exclude others. Now here at home in South Africa, our boundaries are far less subtle. The bubbles have become smaller compared to how they used to be in the days of the Group Areas Act, but they're still in place. We've also, it seems, become consumed by fear of violent crime. You hardly see a house without a high wall, particularly in the wealthier suburbs. And security features become a selling point for properties. This graph is alluding to the fact that only 2 out of 10 black African households own a car, as compared to more than 9 out of 10 white households. So there's still massive inequality in this country. So it begs the question that when we design buildings like this, who exactly are we designing for? Probably not the majority of South Africans. An unreasonably high proportion of our public spaces are allocated to a privileged minority. Now, Richard Rogers speaks of the ideal of a city of easy contact, where the public realm encourages community and facilitates communication and trade. So this is our version of the city of easy contact. Just about the only place where the poor get to interface with and mingle with the rich is at these kind of traffic light marketplaces that are at every major intersection around our cities. And the contact's kind of distilled down to a momentary exchange of eye contact between motorist and hawker, pamphlet dispatcher, window washer or beggar through a car window. So the question then becomes, is mobility the new apartheid? Some of the early projects that we engaged in when Ikemeleng was formed in the mid-2000s, a number of urban design frameworks around the country, collaborating with a number of key urban design firms such as 2610 South and Urban Works and others. The focus was very strongly on public infrastructure and also on reimagining the role of the public environment as a kind of nation-building mechanism. As part of this work with the urban design frameworks, we engaged with various stakeholder groupings, communities, property owners, business people, politicians, transport operators. This became an important initiation into South African society, its virtues and its ills. Now, one of the first UDFs that we worked on with 2610 South was 3 UDFs in one, in fact, for nuclear Coronationville and Brixton in the west of Johannesburg. This picture shows the house on Hamilton Street where my father and his siblings grew up. So there was a personal connection with the nuclear area. Now this is also the area that at the moment has been the site of all this unrest, recent unrest and service delivery protests, sparked by a killing of a young mother caught in the crossfire of gangster warfare. What was quite interesting is that the issues that were coming up in the media, principally around inadequate housing, joblessness, nothing being done about the gangsterism, the corruption of the police, were exactly the same issues that were raised when we worked on this UDF 10 years ago. This slide is showing a methodology that we pioneered with 2610 South, where we looked at having, rather than the kind of standard stakeholder consultation meeting where you simply go and present your ideas to the community and get it rubber stamped, we looked at the idea of having 2 meetings. The first one was about formulating a brief, and we issued all the meeting attendees cards where they could, different colored cards where they could write on their top 3 priorities, so in order of preference, and that was mapped and recorded with a series of graphs, but also weighted in terms of importance. In the second meeting, we presented our response to those that brief, and we also issued 3 cards: a green one for things that they agree with, a red one for things that they disagree with that we were presenting, and a yellow one for things that we'd forgotten about. So what was yielded was a UDF for a very large area of Western Johannesburg. New linkages between formerly segregated suburbs, because you've got a collection of different group areas from the apartheid era. New linkages across the railway line that is a big divider between the north and south, and a network of social infrastructure. But in particular, we looked at residential densification along key public transport corridors, and also the idea of a new spine along one of the key streets, north-south streets in the area, through Westbury and Nuclear, Dowling Avenue, that links the old council housing that is so neglected and where the drugs are sold, where it's a kind of epicenter of the gangsterism. Lots of the elements were implemented but I think also because of the fact that it was a municipal project, the components that were allocated to provincial and national spheres of government were never followed through on, and I think that's what you're seeing with the unrest that has broken out lately. It's principally around provincial and national mandates like housing, healthcare, policing in particular, that are lacking, that were never followed through. There's an interesting quote here from Steve Biko's book, I Write What I Like. "I no more work in order to live, I live in order to work." He has to wake up at 4 o'clock, 4:30 in order to walk a long distance to be in time for a bus to town. He works there for a while. So many calls are thrown his way by his boss. At the end of the day, he has to travel the same route, arrive home 8:30, 9 o'clock, too tired to do anything but sleep in order to be on time for work again the next day. So that was Steve Biko recounting the daily routine of a black worker that he'd spoken to back in the 1970s. Now, what is really, I think, quite disturbing is that that's a reality for very many South African commuters, even today, some 45 years later. Now, you can see the image on the left taken from Bartlett and School's book, The Endless City. Most of the cities there have got this kind of spatial pattern where the density increases in the middle. Johannesburg, as a result partly of our apartheid-era spatial planning, but also as a result of a car-dominated planning in the post-94 era, has got this very distorted density pattern where places like Alexandra and Hillbrow and Orange Farm, some of which are on the periphery of the city, are incredibly dense, and yet the core is has got incredibly low density. So one of the projects that kind of came to define Ikemeleng Architects in its early years was our work on the Vaya bus rapid transit. It's a blend of bus, tram and train, with median busways located away from curbside congestion and movement conflict, with raised platforms that facilitate rapid boarding and alighting. And it was really born of this idea that, in actual fact, there isn't physically space to transport all of us by private car. And that's what this comparison is showing. That if every single citizen in a major city of South Africa was to attempt to commute by private car, there simply wouldn't be the space. So the BRT project is kind of an acknowledgement of the difficulty of absorbing the poorer South Africans within the inner core of the city. So it's a key socio-spatial transformation intervention whereby key nodes along transport corridors are densified on the back of a modal shift towards public transport and non-motorised transport. In the words of Deputy Minister of Public Works, public transport is not just about moving people, it is about democratising space, it is about deracialising the spatial geography that is still so deeply entrenched in the South African reality. So the first stations were built, the prototype stations were built next to Joburg Park in 2009. We worked on 5 different designs for the BRT stations, but it became very quickly apparent that, first of all, the city wanted one design throughout the whole network, and also that they wanted a very distinctive architectural language for the stations that would imprint a singular urban iconography across all of Johannesburg, common to Meadowlands and Morningside, to Diepkloof and Dunkeld. So it would kind of become the equivalent of, Joburg's equivalent of London's Tube. But at a local level, it's actually quite destructive. It creates barriers to be able to cross the street. It's got very good intentions at a metropolitan scale, but at a local level, particularly in the inner city, it's got some quite adverse consequences. It needs a lot of elbow room. Now, most of Vaya's network passes through areas that look like this. There's fine-grained township townscape of 8 by 6 meter homes, 3 by 3 meter back rooms. So what we tried to do with the design that was eventually selected was break down the scale of these big 60 meter long stations that sit in the middle of the street, almost so that they become a bit like a bank of back rooms in the middle of the street. Now there's a long tradition globally of transport buildings that celebrate technology, that express engineering details and the joining of structural members. So we designed the stations as a series of standardized elements that were manufactured off-site and quickly assembled on-site. Each of the stations received a unique artwork treatment next to its ticketing module. It's a process that was run by the Trinity session. Stephen Hobbs is in the audience today. He's still working on the current phase of the Rail Vaya. Was to try and engender a kind of location-specific identity that would be overlaid on the kind of metropolitan identity. And the artworks also represent a kind of shift in scale. So the stations are kind of almost designed to be read at a vehicular scale from a distance, from the sidewalk on opposite the stations. The artworks are far more immediate and kind of work at a scale where they can be viewed through a bus window or from within the ticketing module. So these are our ultimate clients for the BRT system. It's people that are used to queuing in dirty taxi ranks. So the Rail Vaya design was all about rebranding the notion of public transport towards an experience that's reliable, clean, safe, modern. We also attempted to design the screens in such a way that it would encourage cross-ventilation and passive cooling of the station, so it doesn't have any mechanical cooling. It's probably also the only one of our designs that's ever likely to be trashed both by service delivery protesters and the Hulk. So that's something that we can hang on to. Okay, so following on from our work on the physical infrastructure, we also got involved in some land use planning and urban design guidelines that we worked on with Mohammed Mayat Architects and Urban Designers back in 2009. So these were aimed at trying to set a template for densification of the BRT corridors and the station nodes, and also included ideas around public space reconfigurations to accommodate increased pedestrian footfall within these station nodes. We also looked at a series of typical street sections that would envisage wider street widths to allow for widened sidewalks to cater for increased pedestrian footfall, and kind of desirable building typologies to line these streets within the station nodes, and ideal scenarios around street edge interfaces. So this work led us to be approached by the city around about 2012 to conduct a visioning exercise for 4 nodes, key nodes within the city of Johannesburg that were eventually integrated into the city's planning policies. Those 4 nodes were SANDTON, STRETFORD, Orlando, and the inner city. So the first one, SANDTON, the focus was on the SANDTON's function as a financial services hub, and also on how it might become more inclusive. Because if you know SANDTON, there's this hard grid of streets, blank wall interfaces along lots of the major routes, very difficult environment for pedestrians to traverse. So we looked at how it might transform on a kind of 10-year interval. So we're actually approaching 2020 now. Proliferation of upmarket residential developments that is happening right now. So we looked at the idea of repurposing Rivonia Road, narrowing Rivonia Road to make it more of a kind of pedestrian priority high street, and that the traffic would be pushed to the outer ring and make the core more pedestrian friendly. By 2030, a shift in travel patterns towards public transport and ride sharing was assumed, and some of those parking plinths of the big office buildings could potentially begin to be converted into cafes and shops and bars that open up onto the street. By 2040, there'll be further densification, and you'd start to see the impact of inclusionary housing policies. So some of the housing developments would include gap housing, affordable housing, so that it become more of a mixed income residential area. An expansion of the walkable core into the neighbouring suburbs. Now, some of this work led to a real project that Osmond Lange has just completed, the SANDTON Loop, which is a NMT and pedestrian priority set of infrastructure along the BRT, soon to be open BRT route loop around SANDTON CBD. With the inner city, the focus was on leveraging on its status as a continental marketplace. So by 2020, the International Transit and Shopping Centre, the long-distance bus and taxi facility that you can see going up at Kazerni right now, that would be in place, as well as several upgrades to key public spaces. Then we looked further ahead. The idea of pedestrianising Noord and Sophie de Bruyn Street and Wolmaran Street, that the railway sidings, some of them would be relocated to enable us to put a park beneath the Nelson Mandela Bridge that would become the focus of where the city can host concerts and outdoor events. So become a little bit like Johannesburg's equivalent of Central Park, New York Central Park. By 2040, the idea of having 300,000 new residential units within the inner city, so a shift away from office buildings towards inner city residential, and distinctive quarters, each with their own character: Little Lagos, Chinatown, Somali Town, Little Kinshasa, and the Ethiopian Quarter, would be celebrated and expressed so that they become places not just for locals but for international tourists to come visit. Now, Stretford, on the southern edge of the city in Orange Farm, is 30-40 kilometres away from the CBD. The focus here was on creating an enabling framework for social mobility and providing support infrastructure for the non-economically active. So by 2020, we see the provision of new social infrastructure, libraries, clinics, sports facilities. By 2030, the expansion of the transit-oriented development around the Prasa station and the introduction of free Wi-Fi in public spaces. By 2040, it becomes a node for small businesses and for residential expansion and densification. Then Orlando in Soweto. The focus here was on densification and job creation along the BRT route. So 2020, public environment upgrade to Mookie Street, which got horribly denuded when the BRT went in. There used to be a lot of mature trees were along Mookie Street, but it's almost like the engineers aimed for the trees, so it ended up looking like a bit of a desert. So by 2030, a new Mashinini Park on the old sports field and a footbridge link across to a public square linking to the station. And the beginnings of incremental owner-led self-build densification. So a very different pattern from SANDTON in the inner city, where it would mostly be developer-led. In the township, because you've got this fine-grained townscape, we looked at ideas of how densification would happen on an incremental basis, a stand-by-stand basis. Then lastly, 2040, further densification. It becomes a location for businesses seeking more affordable rents compared to the inner city and the northern suburbs, and a township vibe energized by density. So following that project, we were approached by an international organization called the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. It's a New York-based advocacy organization. We were one of 10 architects selected to represent their city and to look at the impact of transit-oriented development intervention on a 1 square kilometre section of our city. So the Our Cities Ourselves exhibition opened in Manhattan in 2010 and toured all 10 cities. Others included Jakarta, Ahmedabad in India, Budapest, and so on. So we looked at the same square kilometre that we'd looked at for the SUSUP exercise, in Orlando, characterized by three bands. You've got the Klipsbreek floodplain, the civic and institutional band that is to the west of Mookie Street, and the residential band to the east of Mookie Street, and looked at how those would be transformed by the impact of the BRT route over time. So this was really a kind of further rendering, further development of the exercise we did for the City of Johannesburg's planning department. So this image is an image of a public space around the Rail Vaya station, including a ticketing hub, the idea of integrated ticketing between Rail Vaya, Gautrain and Prasa. The activation of Mookie Street so that it becomes a kind of South African version of the Champs-Élysées, lined by buildings with ground floor retail, but our own South African version with spaces and facilities for traders. And a major public square where the current car park is for the big community hall. Turn that into a major public space that anchors the precinct, a community space for gatherings and events and after-match festivities for Pirates fans when Pirates play at the nearby Orlando Stadium. Then we also looked at this narrative that was created around incremental self-built densification, geared towards income generation from creating space that could be rented out and create an income for the property owner, and job creation so that it would be encourage mixed use, ground floor businesses and residential apartments above, transforming from this kind of standalone township house towards a multi-level mixed-use building typology. Now, flowing from our work on the BRT, we also worked on a number of public space projects along the Phase 1 BRT route, which I'm going to show you, not all of these, but a couple of them, a couple of the key spaces. Now, the first of which was work within Johannesburg shopping district, the retail improvement district. Despite inner city decay, it still functions as the city's major retail hub. It's kind of Soweto CBD, but it's home to some of the biggest stores of chains like Edgar's and Truworths, and even Woolworths has got one of the largest stores in the country. So our plan for the retail improvement district revolved around creating pedestrian priority routes along Kerk Street, linking Bank City to the High Court, and along Joubert Street, which links Park Station Concourse in the north, all the way down to Gandhi Square in the south, and that these would be these kind of primary pedestrian distributors within the RID and the primary shopping streets. Then also this idea of crucible spaces, nodes within the precinct and along those routes that would act as kind of almost like the event spaces that you get in shopping malls, but on an urban scale. We looked at some walkability guidelines. We designed streets for walking rather than just for driving and parking. Looked at how you might remove obstacles, widen the sidewalks, create a little bit more generosity, especially on the street corners, minimize elevational changes. And then we also looked at how you might incorporate informal trading within the retail improvement district. It was happening informally. A lot of the shopkeepers, the shop owners were complaining about their doors being blocked by informal traders. So we looked at a way that the two could coexist and that they might actually kind of cross-fertilize each other and complement each other even, because it's a kind of unique offering of Johannesburg is that you can go and shop in a major retail chain but also buy from an informal trader. It's one of the few places you can do that. So Kerk Street Market was one of the first markets that we developed based on those topologies that I showed in the previous slide. A median market, so it's kind of like the BRT of informal trading. It sits up the middle of the street, pulls the traders away from the face of the buildings and obstructing their entrances, so that you essentially got two parallel streets. So the roof elements are high enough that they let lots of light in, enable passive surveillance, but also provide shelter to the traders. And then there was a bigger plan that incorporated new public spaces, one of which was the Ernest Oppenheimer Park, which sits at the rear of the Rissik Street Post Office. Now this is what it looked like before. Neglected, poorly maintained paving area, people making fires at night, lots of litter. It used to be home to the Leaping Impala sculpture that was eventually relocated to the Anglo precinct because it kept getting vandalized. So we looked at the idea of a sculpture garden that would sit at the southern entrance to the the shopping district. You've got a diagonal pathway that divides the park into two distinct pockets, an active pocket and a passive pocket. A multi-purpose court in the northern pocket, geared for active games and sports, and a mini amphitheatre for events and performances in the southern pocket. So there's a second pathway that zigzags across the main pathway that links a series of sculptures and seats. The Public Artworks project, again overseen by the Trinity session. A new Impala sculpture was put in place, giant replica of the Oppenheimer diamond, and seats adorned with text celebrating Joburg's place in popular culture. Basketball court was installed geared to the new younger resident profile of the inner city, a shift away from the older resident profile of the past. And then this amphitheatre with this kind of praying mantis roof canopy that got nicknamed in the office Crouching I-beam Hidden Channel. Then on to Mary Fitzgerald Square. It's actually been upgraded twice. We were responsible for the second one. It was necessitated because the first time they did it, the electrical infrastructure wasn't sufficiently protected. So every time Standard Bank Joy of Jazz or a major event came to the square, the electrical infrastructure was getting damaged. So they had to lift all the paving and replace it, so it was seen as an opportunity to do something different. So we were the designers for the second time around. So Mary Fitzgerald is one of the most important civic spaces in the city. It's one of the few places in Joburg where large numbers of people can gather to watch performances or outside broadcasts or to protest or march. It's the primary gathering place for most of the marches that happen in the inner city. It anchors the Newtown Cultural Precinct, but it also struggles with this dichotomy of its dual role as a place of gathering on the one hand and a place of day-to-day use on the other hand, animated when full, but bland and overscaled when empty. So we attempted to overcome some of these shortcomings. We mapped movement patterns during its kind of dormant period to look at how people were passing through the square or using the square, and we attempted to respond to these. So we came up with this idea of a large public space bisected by a central axis, so we kept that from the previous design that is aligned with the front entrance to Museum Africa. And we introduced a paving pattern that mimics movement and crowd gathering patterns. Now, usually we're kind of against this idea that you do funny things with the patterns in the paving because you don't read them except on the architect's drawing. Mary Fitzgerald Square, because of where it's sited next to the double-decker highway, it's one of the few public spaces where you can play with paving and it can actually be seen without using a drone. So we introduced this idea of congested cores that gradually fragment into smaller, looser pockets around the edge of the square. Then around the edge, we introduced small amoeba-like pockets of softer landscaping that introduce a kind of gentle shoulder that envelop the square, shielding it from the fast-moving vehicle traffic and offering places to sit or lie on the grass, particularly when the square is not in use by a large gathering. And what was interesting is the edge of the square started to become occupied. You started to see people coming out and having lunch or sitting and talking on the benches and so on, which was quite encouraging. On to Vilakazi Street precinct in Soweto. Now, as I'm sure many of you are aware, Vilakazi Street is famous as the only street in the world that was home to two Nobel laureates, former President Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It's also famous for a number of the events linked to the June 76 student uprising that many people think was a turning point in the freedom struggle. So one of the important steps we took at the beginning of the project was to conduct a kind of literature review and interviews with some of the people that were around at the time to establish exactly what happened in the space and where they happened. So this is a kind of mapping of the confrontation between police and students who were marching from Morris Isaacson School down towards Orlando Police Station, down Vilakazi Street at the corner of Moyama and Vilakazi. And this is where we're told it all kicked off. A dog was released into the crowd by the police. The dog was stoned to death, and that prompted the police to start shooting indiscriminately at kids, and they carried on shooting as the kids were running away. So the red is showing the patterns of where the school children were, and the blue There's a housing development now, but it used to be an open site. That was where the police were gathered with their Caspers. Then further up Moyama Street, at the corner of Moyama and Vilakazi, a similar confrontation took place, with some of the students trying to get down an alternative route to get to Orlando police station. Again, they were stopped, and shooting started here as well. And this is the sequence, the famous sequence that many of you will recognize with Sam Mzima's photograph when Hector Peterson was shot. So we were able actually to identify the spot where Hector fell, and Mbuyisa Makubu picked him up and ran along the street, along Sisulu Street, and where the famous photographs were taken, on the way to Pomalong Clinic, where he was examined and pronounced dead. Now, the first student that was actually killed prior to all these other confrontations was a young man called Hastings Ndlovu. Further down Kumalo Street, and the border between Orlando West and Orlando East. So we were also able to piece together how this happened and where exactly Hastings was shot. It was on the bridge itself. So all of these clues became this research became a rationale for how we started to intervene within the precinct and to mark these spots and spaces where these events happened. We approached, and I say we, it was a joint venture between Ikemeleng Architects, Urban Works, and Kalsarel Women's Projects, a landscape architecture firm. We approached the upgrade of the Vilakazi Street precinct with a mix of trepidation and inspiration, having met people like Antoinette Sitole, who's Hector Peterson's sister, and gained an understanding of exactly what happened in the 70s. We also looked at this idea, a lot of you will be familiar with, that when homeowners in many of the townships upgrade their driveways, they often extend that paving onto the sidewalk in front of the house. And so you get this patchwork of different paving materials, different paving treatments along the sidewalk that almost mimics the townscape grain of the buildings themselves. So we tried to do the same thing with our paving intervention. And there you see this kind of patchwork of different paving materials that are extended from the cadastral grid. So some simple pragmatics: sidewalks to walk on, places to sit, places to trade, and a kind of an enabling framework for the street to come alive, which it has done ever since this upgrade went in. It's one of the biggest impacts we've seen of any of our public environment upgrade projects. And during the 2010 World Cup in particular, and on Youth Day every year, the street is abuzz with activity. You really see lots and lots of people come, and we've seen a big transformation with lots of the houses along Vilakazi Street converting to businesses, one of which we're actually working on for a private client at the moment. There was also a very rich public artworks program, born of a series of community workshops, again coordinated by the Trinity session, that added an extra layer of narrative to the already rich streetscape. Now, this is actually an artwork that wasn't implemented, which I'm very disappointed about, because it was my favorite one of the workshop process that emerged from the workshop process. This was going to be placed on the wall of the Tutu residence, and it was a sculpture that featured a secretary bird perched on a snake, the body of which was made of a machine gun magazine, and it was symbolic of this bird overcoming the evil of the apartheid snake, which unfortunately was never taken forward. But many of the others were. The Vilakazi hands became a gateway sculpture at the southern end of Vilakazi Street. The wire models of the students protesting marked the point of the confrontation between the students and the police at corner Moyama and Vilakazi. And there you can see some of the translations. And these artworks have become points of commemoration that happen every year on June the 16th, when people gather. You know, there's a kind of tradition, many people to dress up in their old school uniforms on Youth Day and commemorate the sacrifices that were made by that generation of students. And a lot of them go and travel to Vilakazi Street to commemorate the role that these individuals played in the freedom struggle. And a lot of them use the artworks as points of commemoration. Now, this artwork was a very interesting interpretation. that sits outside Tsukumzi's restaurant at the lower end of the Nobel Laureate Walk. There's a Tswana proverb that says, "Two bulls can't stay in the same kraal." And so this was alluding to the fact that you've got these two Nobel laureates. But in actual fact, their points of departure in the freedom struggle were very different. You know, Nelson Mandela, prior to his imprisonment, was one of the instigators of the armed struggle, versus Bishop Tutu's role as the kind of peacemaker. So we thought it was a very interesting interpretation and variation on this idea that there's these two Nobel Peace Laureates, but in actual fact one was kind of the person that instigated armed struggle, and the other one played a key kind of peacemaking role. There are exhibition panels at all the key points around the precinct that commemorate the events that happened on various street corners. And there's also directional signage that delineate a series of trails. So another project in the same kind of vein was our work on Solomon Mahlangu Freedom Square in Mamelodi. The square bears the name of one of Mamelodi's most famous citizens, Solomon Kalushi Mahlangu, the young MK freedom fighter that was executed in 1979. But it's also infamous as a site of another apartheid-era atrocity. On the 21st of November 1985, police again opened fire on protesters, killing 13 and injuring 154. So again, we attempted to map this sequence of events that happened on that day. So the red again is showing the movement patterns of the protesters, and the blue, the police. So the sequence was that the crowd was marching from the H.M. Pinchy Stadium southwards towards the municipal offices, and Caspers were taking up positions to block the protesters from leaving Mamelodi and entering Silverton, the industrial area to the south. The mayor of Mamelodi was in a Casper at the entrance to the municipal offices. He stood on the top of the Casper ready to address the crowd, but then thought better of it and retreated into the Casper. Shortly afterwards, a police helicopter flew over and dropped tear gas on the protesters. Now, inevitably, the protesters scattered, and as they scattered, the police opened fire. So lots of people shot in the back, and you'll see the line on the northern side. This line, I don't know if you can see that there. The straight black line was a fence line that used to exist, and lots of people were trapped. Lots of the dead were trapped against that fence with nowhere to escape to, and that's where lots of the people were killed. So the layout of the park was informed by these mappings that we created that looked at where exactly the key historical events had happened. There were two key axes that we kept intact that were already in the park. One linking the entrance to the municipal offices to the existing Solomon Mahlangu statue in the southwestern corner, and then another linking the statue, a new axis linking the statue to the street corner of Letwaba and Makubela Street, which is where the massacre happened. So we began, one of the first small interventions we made is the statue used to look outwards towards the road intersection. So we decided this is not a good idea. Let's reorientate the statue so he faces the park, faces the public space, faces the pedestrians. We also introduced this ribbon walkway that meanders through the park, linking various points of significance and artwork sites. And then we created this gathering space that straddles the street intersection so that when there's a big gathering, the streets are closed and it occupies the road, a little bit like when there's a funeral or a wedding in the township and they close the street to occupy the street. So the same kind of notion. Again, we worked with the Trinity Session on a community artwork project. This is some of the artworks that were produced by, there's actually a local artworks collective that works on the site, and it culminated in an exhibition. Again, one of my favorite artworks wasn't produced. This is the tree that is commemorating the words that Solomon Mahlangu was said to have uttered on his way to the gallows, that my blood will nourish the tree that will bear the fruits of freedom. So this was going to be the tree that was nourished, that was going to be sitting in the middle of the traffic circle on the northern side of the site, but hasn't yet been implemented. There's a pair of memorial walls at the entrance to the gathering space. They've got this mosaic treatment that's almost like a serpent-like texture. and candle-like commemorative bollards to the 13 people killed. So this is the reorientated statue being unveiled by the then Tshwane mayor and by Chief Mahlangu, who is Solomon Mahlangu's older brother. This was a gateway artwork facing outwards to the road, the mother of melodies. That's the translation of Mamelodi. And a series of views of the gathering space on the day it was opened. That's a view down that main axis from the gathering space looking back towards the statue. So a shift outside the borders of South Africa now to the city of Kumasi in Ghana. Ghana's second city, home to 3 million people, capital of the Ashanti region. Now I'm sure many of you will know that the Ashanti region is the home of kente cloth. In fact, there's a village just outside Kumasi called Bonri, where there's a concentration of kente cloth weavers. It's a very, very rich cultural heritage within that region. So this is our site. It's quite an unusual opportunity. A 30-hectare site, open site right in the middle of the city, of a major African city. It's a former race course. And the horses are long gone, but it's owned, or it's controlled by the Asante Hene, who is the Ashanti monarch. And this is the picture on the right is a picture of us showing the Asante Hene around Melrose Arch. So there's a major festival that happens every 6 weeks. Well, it's a smaller festival every 6 weeks, but an annual event called Adekese, when clans from around the region assemble to pay homage to the king. They form up in a horseshoe gathering with the king at the centre in Kumasi's main stadium. It's a very rich visual and musical event. Lots of drumming, lots of tributes paid to the king, musical tributes, gifts presented. So the project began when the developer, who is linked to the king, walked into our office in Melrose Arch one day and says he wants to build Melrose Arch in Kumasi, to which my partner that received him said, sounds a bit odd, he sounds a bit crazy, maybe you should talk to Jonathan. So I think I'm in charge of the crazy department. So we started off with this idea of this kind of new CBD for Kumasi, but we wanted to do it in such a way that it wasn't just a kind of generic mixed-use commercial precinct. We wanted it to embody something of the rich tradition, the rich culture that we observed in Kumasi. And working with a local architect, a local Ghanaian architect who is also originally from Kumasi. This idea that we create this green spine along the path of a stream that runs through the middle of the racecourse site that links a city plaza on the northern end to a gathering space on the southern end, where the gathering space would replace the stadium. So it would be kind of a natural amphitheatre, but a more appropriate space for this Adekese festival. So we introduce this grid of streets that bisects the green spine, with artworks positioned at the points of intersection that commemorate and narrate the lives of the 16 previous kings, and we leave space for the future kings as well. And each of those streets would take the name of the previous kings. So the collective effect is that if you walk down this spine, it's almost a bit like an Ashanti National Mall, like the version of the National Mall in Washington, where if you walk down, you can actually understand the chronological history of the Ashanti monarchy and the role that it plays in Ashanti society. So it would link then to the idea that you have this Ashanti National Monument, a royal monument on one end, and the City Hall for the Kumasi Metropolitan Assembly at the other end. So this kind of linkage between the royalty and city government. Then we looked at the idea that the former racecourse path could become the main vehicular distributor, so that the core is then kind of preserved for pedestrian priority. And then ultimately that it would become this kind of new urbanist precinct, a mix of retail, office, residential, hotel and education. But the buildings that front onto this green spine would have a special treatment that would express Ashanti identity through colour, through texture, through geometry, facing onto the green spine. So this is what's happening at the moment. We're looking at the first phase that comprises a retail and office development and a hotel and residential apartments also in the pipeline. Shift to the other side of the African continent, another African metropolis, this time Nairobi, Kenya, which I find a very interesting city because it shares a lot of Johannesburg's virtues, but also its ills. It's also moving in this kind of car-dominated direction that excludes the poor and marginalizes them in favor of motorists and car owners. So this is a site that sits in Westlands, which is, I guess, Nairobi's equivalent of Rosebank. It's just to the north of the CBD, but you've seen a lot of the big corporates move out of the CBD for similar reasons that they've moved out of Johannesburg inner city and set up these kind of office park type environments that can be controlled. Now, if we think we have a paranoia about security, the Kenyans even more so. And that's largely as a result of the events that happened the second time I was in Nairobi back in 2013, the Westgate massacre, in which 71 people were killed and 200 wounded when Al-Shabaab attacked the Westgate shopping mall just up the road in Westlands. So almost every public or commercial building has a checkpoint outside it. Cars are searched at the gatehouses with mirrors underneath to check they're not carrying explosives. Metal detectors at the entrances to all public buildings and shopping malls and so on you've got to go through. So even more than we've got. So we were tasked with working on this, again, an integrated mixed-use precinct, to incrementally replace an existing development and to increase its bulk. Again, a mix of retail, office, residential and hotel. But what we suggested to the developer is that we shift the security perimeter to the building thresholds, so that rather than having this big heavy gate at the entrance to the precinct, that the building thresholds then become the point of security and the division between public and private, and that you almost have a security regime that's similar to the London Square Mile, where it's based on surveillance and rapid response and the detailed checking only of large vehicles like trucks and buses that are big enough to carry explosives that will do major damage, and then the minor security check happens at the doors to buildings. So we also looked at creating this pedestrian-friendly public realm, and these are the key public spaces within the precinct. Now, Kenya's got this obsession at the moment with these very tall building skyscrapers, which are often built on spec without tenants. At the moment, there's a building under construction that's going to be higher than the Carlton Centre. It'll steal the Africa's tallest building title from us. So that was also part of the brief, is where do we put the tall buildings? So we suggested that they should happen along Chiroma Road on the one side of the precinct, so you don't block light to all the streets and it becomes a very friendly environment for sitting outside. It's not dark and dingy and in shadow all the time. And there starts to become a dialogue between the towers, the streets and the squares, with framed views and terminations of key vistas with the towers talking to the public spaces. Again, we look to move the major vehicle movement to the periphery so that the core can be pedestrian priority, and even the outer ring would have traffic calming features. So again, a mix of retail, office, and with a residential fronting onto the river on the southern side. So that's a kind of notional cross-section with a super basement with a hole in the middle so we can retain the mature trees in a central garden space in the middle of the development. The final project that I'm going to show you is something a bit closer to home. This is in Greenside. It's a project that we're working on at the moment for the JDA. Now, many of you will recognise this. This is the tram circle in Greenside. And of course, what is really noticeable from this image is just how much space is given over to people that are just passing through Greenside. They're not stopping, they're not adding anything to the area, they're not stopping to shop or support the local businesses. They're commuting, they're rat running between Western Johannesburg and Rosebank. And how much space is given over to cars versus pedestrians. So we looked at the idea that the tram circle will be reconfigured as a signalised intersection, and we push it to the corner of that space so that we can create a new public space, so a repositioned intersection. Then we introduced this boomerang-shaped pergola structure along the edge of the public space. That's got trader structures at the one end that you can just see coming into view there. So to have solid roof cover on the extremities on either end of the boomerang, covering the trader spaces on the one end. It will then dematerialize in the center so that it's far more just about shade. And then it will be more solid on the other end where there's an intention to have a tuk-tuk stop that's linked to a park and ride service from Pirates Club nearby. So just some closing thoughts that are kind of some of the points of rationale and thinking behind a lot of this work. We've always attempted to understand the context within which we work. I think a very important part of that is understanding, it's very easy for us as architects and urban designers to get stuck in a kind of middle-class bubble of malls and motorways. The kind of northern suburbs existence, or if you're in Pretoria, the eastern suburbs existence. You need to understand and remember that for the vast majority of South Africans, this is what life is like. So we need to gain an understanding of what the needs and aspirations of ordinary citizens are. You need to understand the social, political, economic, and historical context within which you work so that you can intervene more effectively. Then I think it's also important that you design for everyone, not just your client. There's a very nice quote from David Chipperfield. Our clients are not only those who commission us, but also those who occasionally visit, pass each day, or work in the buildings we design. Anticipating and addressing the undescribed demands of others is where true success lies. So I think it's important that you own your own power and privilege and put it to work. Now, obviously, within our demographically diverse society, there are a lot of power imbalances. There's white privilege, there's male privilege. But what we need to remember as architects, and particularly the students that are entering the architectural profession, once you become an architect, you're part of the ruling class. There are certainly differences in power relations between members of the ruling class, but let's not overly focus on those in comparison to the differences between our power and those of the broader society. There's another fantastic quote there from Frantz Fanon, that there's an extraordinary power in the possession of language. And for me, that is an important part of being an architect, is that part of our training is that we're equipped with the power of persuasion. And we must put that to work, but not just for ourselves and for other people that are part of the ruling class. We need to put it to work for others that maybe don't have a voice, that don't have somebody to stand up for them. We need to try, by all means, to open doors for others and empower others. And then lastly, it's very important that we dream of a better future. Perhaps when crime is not such an issue, when the fences can come down, when private cars are not our primary means of transport anymore, and perhaps when society is a little less unequal. Thank you very much for listening.